Hello and welcome to the Point Blank Show. My name is Abhishek. Our guest today is Annie Lowrey, who writes for The Atlantic on politics and economic policy. But a recent tweet also suggests that she's working on what sounds like a fun piece around folks who've got their tattoos removed. Today, Annie joins me to talk about her fascinating book, Give People Money, which has won many accolades. It was shortlisted for the 2018 Financial Times and McKinsey Business Book of the Year award. Thank you so much, Annie, for agreeing to do this.
Thank you for having me.
And your book's title, for those who don't know the entire one, it says, Give People Money, How a Universal Basic Income Would End Poverty, Revolutionize Work, and Remake the World. Now, the first response to the subhead would be, yeah, right. You give people money. What does that even mean? And what is universal basic income to start with?
Absolutely. So it is a very grandiose title, which I feel like the publisher always, I remember just being, even myself, just being like, whoa, 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 because no place has one of these really. There's sort of versions of a UBI, but the idea with a universal basic income is that everybody, so it's universal, everybody in a community receives an amount of money from the government or from somebody else.
Right.
It is basic in the sense that it covers basic cost of living. So the amount that gets talked about in the United States is usually $1,000 a month, which is not really enough to live on, especially not in a big city, but it does cover quite a bit. The money is unrestricted, so you could use it for whatever you needed to. And it comes indefinitely. So once you start getting it, it never gets taken away. Those are two other elements of it that are sort of dissimilar from other kind of social welfare programs in the US or in other countries.
Right. And as concepts go, would you agree that it is among the most misunderstood ones in that folks who oppose it or don't get it, for instance, do talk about, hey, there's no free lunch, nothing comes out of nothing, you need to work hard to earn your dough.
So yeah, I think there's a bunch of common misconceptions. So one, as you point out, is that people will stop working. We actually have evidence on this. This is generally not true. And where you see reductions in work effort, which is the term that economists use, it's usually because people take more time at home when they have little children, or they retire early, or they stay in school longer, or in between jobs, they'll take a little bit longer to find a new job, which is not a bad thing because that improves usually the quality of the match. So they find maybe a better job by taking another extra couple of weeks. So there's that element of it. There's a lot of misconceptions, right? One is that this is somehow communist. It's really not. It's quite capitalist, right? These people are taking the money and spending it in a capitalist economy. There's no seizure of the production here. So that's a really big one. And then, the idea of getting something for nothing, it's an interesting thought. But the truth is that everybody gets payments from the government and everybody pays into the government in some way or another. And instead of thinking about, people at an individual moment, I always like to think of people across the lifespan. So we are really comfortable with the government, quote unquote, supporting children and seniors. And the government actually does a lot of support of people in the middle of life too, in the US and in high income countries, and also in middle income and low income countries.
And what about those who talk about, if there's free money, you might spend it on drugs, on alcohol. You write a little bit about in your book as well about the prescription drugs in the US, which is a big problem where folks can overdose on those. So is that argument has already been debunked by whatever experiments have been run in whatever shape or form, whether in rich or poor countries?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have a lot of evidence on this. A lot of studies from a lot of different countries have shown that spending goes up when people start getting more cash like this. And spending tends to go up fairly proportionately to what people were spending on before. And that generally means that people, especially lower income people, spend more on what we might think of as basic necessities. So energy costs, food, transportation, gas, utilities, maybe clothing, that kind of thing. Study after study has shown that if vice spending, as it's known, goes up, it only kind of goes up because everything else is going up. It doesn't go up disproportionately. And in a lot of cases, it doesn't go up at all. People don't tend to spend the money on things like junk food, cigarettes, drugs, whatever else it might be. So it's really hard to convince people that folks won't misspend the money or fritter it away. And
Right.
surely some do. And so my kind of question is always like, who cares, right? A little bit. Like,
Mm.
why is it such a horrible idea? Why do we judge the idea of if people were getting this cash and were spending it in a way that we didn't approve of societally? Why do we care about that more for a UBI than we do with like a lot of tax
Mm.
credits or other payments? And what are you getting in return for that increase in vice spending on lotto tickets or whatever else it might
Right.
be? Because if you're eradicating poverty, that doesn't strike me as a bad trade. But it's really hard, especially in the United States and in some other countries, there's a lot of consternation about poverty, right? There's the
Mm.
belief that people are poor because they choose to be poor and they make bad choices. That's not true in
Yeah.
some other countries. So in very low income countries, I actually think this is easier because like everybody is poor or,
Right.
50% of people in a given place will be poor. And it's pretty clear that that's just an accident of birth. That's not something that they chose.
Right.
But it's a really thorny question and one that constantly comes up.
And the only place where I think it's in your book where you talk about Peru, where there was an imperceptible rise in folks spending money on chocolates, sweets, and meals at restaurants because they were getting that cash, and that's a good thing because they could barely afford any of those. So I mean, that's the extent of frittering the money away,
Yeah,
if one has
exactly.
to call that. Yeah.
Yeah, just imagine some Peruvian kids get a couple more pieces of chocolate, right?
Right.
Like that's not, there's a lot of problems on earth, but that's not one of them. That's not one of
Yes.
them. And so I think, there's this constant debate in the United States about people using food stamps on like
Mm.
soda and candy and cake. And it's always like, what if that's a kid who's getting some
Yeah.
treats at a birthday party, right? Or like graduated from 5th grade and is getting something. So I think that,
Oh,
we can chill out about that and sort of say that, yeah, like that's not necessarily a bad thing if people get some things that they enjoy.
yes.
Chocolate strikes me as a very, very wholesome treat, right? Like
Yes.
this is not a huge increase in spending on like hard liquor, right? Like
Right.
small increases in spending on chocolate and a meal in a restaurant, which means that maybe the parents don't have to cook. Like, yeah, this is
Mm.
all good stuff, I think.
And cash, as opposed to welfare schemes or subsidies, like they are called in India, is always a
Yeah.
good substitute, right? Because I think there was one a lady in Kenya that you interviewed, and she was asked whether she would like cash or something in kind, and she thought it was a trick question because what better than cash? Because
Yes.
she could decide where to spend that money.
Yes. Yeah. And so, India has a number of subsidy schemes that
Yeah.
work well and a number of programs. So the midday meal program that have absolutely proven benefits. And for people who are not familiar, the midday meal
Mm.
program, right, it's pretty simple. It gives lunch to kids, right?
Right.
Correct me, you know this better than I do. So correct me if I'm wrong about any of this.
Yeah.
That's not to say that India's many kind of subsidies, allotments, programs for the poor to hire them. India has a very large work scheme, for instance, that those things
Mm.
don't work. It's just like a bang for your buck. A lot of cases, in almost all cases, a subsidy would probably be better as cash. And
Yes.
again, maybe not
No,
all,
in
but
fact,
yeah. And it's not to say that the subsidies don't do anything like those gas
right.
subsidies, right? Like they do, they do. It's just, would they be somewhat more effective as cash? Would people like them more? But cash is
Mm.
politically difficult, which was something you were gesturing to before, right? Also, what if there is that sort of sense of like, I can't believe that you're just giving cash out to people. You
Yeah.
should be giving them cooking oil and you should be financing education, right? It's for most people, it's not really politically palatable to do cash. And I think that that's really important. That's a very real thing.
Mm.
It's
Mm.
important to take into account.
So it's more like we can't trust people who need the cash most to spend the cash wisely. So that is the
Yeah.
kind of assumption on which this is based. And you talked about midday meal program. It worked brilliantly, but Annie, during the pandemic, because the schools were shut, the midday meal program was shut altogether. So had that been replaced with a simple cash transfer, and it could have been some other country. This is India because it just happens to be a country that you visited for this program. But that is one impediment where an unprecedented event came in, which nobody really
Yeah.
thought of, but it was a subsidy couldn't do enough. And of course, there are, in fact, even in Bollywood movies, the villains in the of 1970s were the fair price shop owners.
Yes.
who fleece, you reported in Jharkhand,
Yes.
from there, where you found that not everyone who was entitled to those 2 rupee rice got it. They would always, the fair price shop owner would find a reason why he could at least have some of it himself. And I think
It really struck me when I was there just how vast this system is. You have all of these,
hmm,
these shops and these people and these weights, and you have to run them and you have to go to the specific one and prove who you are. And, it's a lot of freight. And as you point out, part of the problem with this direct provision, so something like the midday meal program is, right, like then it's inflexible. Then people can't use the lunch if they're not sitting there and eating the lunch, right?
right.
And so that's kind of an argument for cash. And yeah, I mean, India is an outlier in having a lot of complexity around a lot of these provisions that it has for lower
Right.
income and middle income folks, right? They're often kind of complicated. There's a lot of them. And they come with this kind of like heft of administration that
Hmm.
the Indian state takes
Do you
on.
think it's too populist even for the best or worst of the politicians to consider such a program as universal basic income? Because if the cash were to go directly to the beneficiaries, then what about the middlemen who, at the moment, can have some of
Yeah.
it?
There's this big debate in the United States right now about the IRS, which is the tax authority, has all of your data, and you still need to like derive your own taxes and pay
Hmm.
them, and you get all these penalties if you do it wrong, but it's really complicated. And there's no reason that most people couldn't just have the IRS send you a note, say this is what you owe, or this is how much you're getting back, and like be done with it, right?
Hmm.
But there's these tax prep companies that literally lobby in Washington to keep the system as it is, because then,
Right.
they get to take their little cut. Yeah, there's all these middlemen here, right? Like there's all these legal aid societies and nonprofits to help. And
Hmm.
again, in every country, there's like this version of
Is
it.
is cash unsexy for, or doesn't have enough marketing behind it? See, donors are more likely to donate for a cause. So
Yeah.
if there is a cleft lip surgery for a kid, or an education of a girl child, or malaria to eradicate, so it's, as a donor, I would want to know that which cause it is going to. And maybe there is a photoshopped image somewhere of a well-meaning NGO, but that's what sells. And just giving away cash probably doesn't. Is that one reason as well? Psychologically, it hasn't
Absolutely.
done well.
It's kind of unsexy. And so,
Hmm.
I think the circumstances in which you see it. So, one place in which cash is really effective is refugee relief.
Hmm.
So, when people are fleeing a place because of violence, because of something having to do with climate or, fires, earthquakes, whatever it is, it's really, really effective to give cash. Notably, a few of the things that you mentioned there are things that actually probably do work better than cash, right?
Mhm.
Like have a bigger bang for the buck. So some of the public health interventions, like I think that there's like a real argument for spending money on
Right.
that versus cash, right? The school stuff, it's harder, right? People, for instance, really, really love financing school buildings. So they'll think we're going to build a school in community X. But
Right.
like the school doesn't do anything unless you have teachers and unless the people want to send their kids there. And
Yeah.
we've seen over and over again that those kind of infrastructural things don't actually work that well. So I think you're totally right. Like I think the conversation about it has changed a lot, but I
Hmm.
think that there's still that skepticism. People still want to see something with their name on it.
Ah.
And I think that there's still that kind of like, that feeling of like, well, we know better and this is what we're doing and this is how we're doing it. And I think that India is a really interesting case where you have a lot of very low income people, a lot of deeply poor places, but India has a lot of very rich people, right?
Hmm.
Like it's hugely industrialized. It's a very, very large government. And I think it's important there to remember that one way to make sure that you are getting money to the people who need it, not the people who don't, is through the
Right.
tax system, right?
Right.
So you can always tax it back. And so I think it always makes sense when you're thinking about transfers to also be talking about taxes.
Right.
But yeah, India, I think is like a very interesting case where you do have a lot of like subsistence level
Hmm.
poverty still, but you have one of these big, powerful governments. You have a pretty big tax base. You have lots and lots of wealthy companies and people to tax.
Right.
So I think it probably suggests itself as one of the countries where it might work the best.